Winnifred Ostrander had learned, in the 3 years since her husband's death, to say the hardest truth first, and let a man decide for himself whether he could stomach the rest of it. "I come with 4 children and no dowry," she wrote to Cornelius Beckwith, before ever accepting his invitation to correspond further, laying the fact out plainly in the second line of her very first letter, rather than burying it somewhere a less honest woman might have hidden it until the wedding day made it too late to matter. She had watched 2 other prospective matches cool considerably once the particulars of her situation became clear, and she preferred the sting of an early rejection to the deeper cut of a late one. Cornelius Beckwith read that line more than once, sitting alone at his kitchen table in Elm Hollow, Nebraska territory, in a ranch house that had felt considerably too large and too quiet since his first wife's departure, some 4 years back. He was a man who understood plainly what it meant to enter a marriage, weighed by dowries and land and family fortunes, having lived through exactly such an arrangement once already. And something in Winnifred's blunt refusal to soften her circumstances struck him as the rarest kind of honesty he'd encountered in a very long while. He wrote back within the week, telling her simply that he had no need of a dowry, having land and cattle enough of his own, and that 4 children struck him as considerably more valuable than any sum of money a family might have offered alongside a bride. Winnifred read that reply with the particular wariness of a woman who had heard generous promises before, and watched them evaporate once reality set in. But she answered his letter regardless, cautiously willing to test whether his words carried any actual weight behind them. Their correspondence continued through the winter, each letter a little more honest than the last. Until Cornelius finally proposed, she traveled to Elm Hollow that spring to meet him properly, before either of them committed to anything more permanent. Winnifred agreed, though she made the journey with her 4 children in tow and her guard fully raised, having learned the hard way that a man's letters and a man's actual patience rarely matched perfectly once tested by the daily noise and mess of an actual household. She warned him again, standing on the Elm Hollow platform with her eldest daughter's hand in hers and 3 more children arranged around her like a small, watchful army, that whatever he had imagined from her letters, the reality of 4 children under one roof would prove louder and more exhausting than any correspondence could properly convey. Cornelius looked at the assembled family for a long moment, and Winnifred braced herself for the flicker of retreat she had learned to expect from men confronted suddenly with the full weight of what they were considering. "Then I'm getting the better deal," Cornelius told her, and he said it looking directly at the children rather than at her, as though the observation were simply an honest accounting rather than a gallant compliment meant to smooth over an awkward moment. Winnifred did not believe him yet, not fully, having heard similarly generous words before from men who changed their minds within a season, but something in the plain, unhurried way he said it kept her from dismissing him outright, the way caution urged her to. "I have watched a great many widows travel west, carrying exactly this same particular fear, that any kindness offered toward their children was merely a performance meant to secure the mother's hand, and Winnifred carried that fear onto the Beckwith ranch with her that first evening, watching Cornelius's every interaction with her children for the tell that would eventually reveal his true intentions. She found, to her considerable surprise, that the tell never came. Not that first evening, nor in the many evenings that followed. The ranch house itself surprised her too, larger and better kept than she had expected from a bachelor's description, though she noticed quickly the particular emptiness of it, rooms that seemed arranged for a family considerably larger than the one man currently occupying them. She did not ask about it that first night, sensing instinctively that the house's quiet held some story Cornelius was not yet ready to share, and she busied herself instead settling her children into the 2 spare rooms he had prepared for them, complete with quilts that looked, curiously, freshly made rather than merely borrowed from storage. Ida, her shy youngest, refused to settle that first night, unused to the unfamiliar creaks of a new house. And it was Cornelius, rather than Winnifred, who finally coaxed the girl to sleep, sitting outside her door humming some half-remembered tune until her crying quieted into steady breathing. Winnifred, watching from the hallway, felt the last of her guarded reserve begin, cautiously, to loosen its grip. Cornelius's own history, which he did not share fully until several weeks into Winnifred's stay, carried a wound that ran parallel to her own fears, in ways neither of them fully understood until much later. His first marriage, arranged by his father to secure a neighboring family's land through a favorable match, had been a cold, transactional affair from its very first day, a union built entirely on acreage and cattle counts rather than any genuine affection between the two people actually bound by it. His first wife, a woman named Clarissa, had made clear within the first year that she considered the marriage a business arrangement rather than a partnership, and Cornelius had spent 5 long years in a house that felt, despite its size, considerably emptier than Winnifred's modest circumstances had ever felt to her. Their son, a boy named Peter, had been born into that cold household and had died of a fever at 4 years old, while Clarissa was away visiting her family, a tragedy Cornelius had never fully forgiven himself for, certain that a warmer, more attentive household might have caught the illness sooner. Clarissa left for good within a year of Peter's death, unable or unwilling to remain in a marriage that had never carried real warmth, even before grief settled over it entirely. And Cornelius had spent the 4 years since largely alone, working his ranch with a diligence that kept his hands too busy to dwell overlong on the empty rooms surrounding him. He told Winnifred all of this plainly, one evening on the porch after the children had gone to bed, watching her face carefully for the particular pity he had come to dread from anyone who learned the full account. Winnifred did not offer pity. She told him instead that she understood, more than most, the particular weight of building a life around a marriage that valued property over people, having watched her own late husband's family treat her similarly in the months following his death, weighing her worth as though she were a line item in an estate rather than a grieving widow with 4 children to raise. She told Cornelius that Peter's death was not his failure to prevent, but Clarissa's failure to build the kind of household where such failures became less likely in the first place. Cornelius absorbed that assessment slowly, having carried the guilt so long he had rarely allowed himself to consider it might not be entirely his own to bear. He told Winnifred that her plain refusal to offer easy comfort meant considerably more to him than gentler words might have managed, since he had grown deeply suspicious, over the years, of comfort offered without any real understanding behind it. They sat together a long while that evening, 2 people who had each learned, through very different losses, exactly how much a household could cost when it was built on the wrong foundation, and something in the shared recognition settled between them more solidly than any amount of courtship small talk could have managed. Winnifred found herself, for the first time since her husband's death, imagining a partnership built on something sturdier than mere convenience or necessity. She asked him gently, before they parted for the night, whether he still kept anything of Peter's in the house, and Cornelius admitted that he did, a small box of the boy's belongings stored in a trunk he rarely opened. Winnifred asked to see it, not out of idle curiosity, but because she understood, from her own grief, that a person needed somewhere safe to set such things down, rather than carry them entirely alone. And Cornelius, after a long moment's hesitation, agreed. He opened the trunk the following evening, and together they looked through a boy's small collection of carved animals and worn picture books, Cornelius narrating each item with a tenderness Winnifred suspected he had not permitted himself in years. When they finished, he did not close the trunk away in the attic as he usually did, but left it instead in the front room, a small, deliberate act of letting grief occupy space in the house, rather than banishing it entirely, and Winnifred understood the gesture as the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. The children took to Cornelius with a speed that surprised even Winnifred, her eldest son Franklin following him around the ranch, asking endless questions about cattle breeding, her 2 middle children, twins named Hattie and Homer, competing fiercely for his attention during evening chores, and her youngest, a shy 4-year-old named Ida, warming to him more slowly, but no less completely, once he took to reading her to sleep some evenings, when Winnifred's own exhaustion ran too deep for the task. Cornelius, for his part, found himself relearning through the 4 Ostrander children something he had assumed Peter's death had permanently closed off to him, the particular, uncomplicated joy of a full and noisy household. He caught himself, more than once that summer, laughing at some piece of childish nonsense, with a freedom he had not felt in the 5 cold years of his first marriage, or the 4 lonely years following Clarissa's departure, and each time the laughter surprised him with how easily it came. Franklin, 13 and old enough to remember his own father clearly, approached Cornelius directly one afternoon at the forge, and asked him plainly whether he intended to make things permanent with his mother, or whether the family was simply a pleasant diversion until something else caught his interest. Cornelius set down his tools and answered the boy with the same directness he gave every serious question, telling him that he had never in his life felt as certain of anything as he felt about wanting Winnifred and all 4 of her children in his life permanently, and that Franklin was welcome to hold him to that answer for as long as it took to prove itself true. That conversation, relayed to Winnifred that evening with considerable 12-year-old gravity, moved her more than she let show, understanding that her son's guarded heart had extended Cornelius a trust he rarely offered new arrivals in the family's life. She found Cornelius later that night mending a fence by lantern light, and told him what Franklin had shared, and Cornelius admitted, a little sheepishly, that he had meant every word of it, and had in fact been working up the courage to say something similar to her directly. "Then I'm getting the better deal," he told her again, this time with his hand covering hers on the fence rail, and Winnifred felt the old caution in her chest finally begin to ease its grip, replaced slowly by something she had not dared to hope for since her husband's death, a genuine belief that this particular good fortune might not carry the hidden cost she had spent 3 years bracing herself against. The twins, Hattie and Homer, marked their own particular approval of the arrangement that same week by presenting Cornelius with a crudely drawn family portrait, all 6 figures crowded together beneath a lopsided sun, and insisting he pin it to the kitchen wall, where he would see it every morning. He did exactly that, and the drawing remained there through every season that followed, gradually joined by other children's artwork until the once bare kitchen wall told, in crayon and charcoal, plainly and unmistakably, of a household finally filling back in. Ida, still the most cautious of the 4, took the longest to fully trust the new arrangement, watching Cornelius from careful distances for weeks before finally, one evening, climbing unbidden into his lap during the reading hour she had come to treasure. Winnifred, watching from the doorway, felt something in her chest ease completely, for the first time since her husband's death, understanding that even her most guarded child had finally decided this particular man was safe to love. The first real test of that fragile trust arrived that autumn, when Clarissa, Cornelius's first wife, returned unexpectedly to Elm Hollow, having heard through family connections that her former husband intended to remarry, and, more particularly, that the woman he intended to marry brought 4 children and no property of her own to the union. Clarissa arrived at the ranch uninvited, dressed in considerably finer clothing than Elm Hollow typically saw, and informed Cornelius directly that she believed he was making a foolish mistake trading his land and cattle for a penniless widow's brood rather than seeking a match that might actually benefit his estate. Winnifred, present for the exchange, felt every old fear rise at once, certain that Clarissa's return represented exactly the kind of complication that had ended her 2 previous prospective matches. A reminder of the world's plain arithmetic regarding what a woman without a dowry was actually worth, in a marriage market that rarely valued anything beyond property and connections. She braced herself, once again, for the flicker of doubt she expected to finally surface in Cornelius's face after 4 months of steady, unwavering warmth. Cornelius did not waver. He told Clarissa plainly, in front of Winnifred and the children, that his 5 years married to her had taught him precisely what a transactional union cost a household, a dead son and a cold house, and 5 years he would never get back, and that he had no intention of repeating that particular mistake for the sake of impressing anyone with his estate's continued growth. He told her that Winnifred's 4 children had brought more genuine wealth into his house in 4 months than Clarissa's father's land had ever managed across 5 full years of marriage. Clarissa left that afternoon considerably chastened, though not before delivering one final remark to Winnifred directly, warning her that a man's affection for another woman's children rarely outlasted the practical difficulties such a large family inevitably brought. Winnifred, rather than retreating from the barb, told Clarissa evenly that she had already survived considerably harder difficulties than any Clarissa could likely imagine, and that she trusted Cornelius considerably more than she trusted a woman who had abandoned her own grieving husband rather than help him carry his grief. That evening, once the children were settled and the ranch had returned to its ordinary quiet, Cornelius found Winnifred on the porch and told her that Clarissa's visit, however unwelcome, had at least settled one lingering question for him entirely, confirming beyond any doubt that he had chosen correctly the second time in a way he had never managed the first. Winnifred, watching the last of the autumn light fade over the Beckwith land, allowed herself finally to believe that the fear she had carried through every prior courtship might not apply to this particular good fortune after all. Franklin, who had listened to the entire exchange with Clarissa from the barn doorway, told his mother afterward that he had never much liked the idea of a stepfather until he watched one stand up so plainly to a woman who clearly deserved considerably less patience than Cornelius had shown her regardless. Winnifred agreed, and found herself, in the days that followed, thinking less about the dowry she lacked, and more about the particular kind of wealth Clarissa's cold visit had accidentally revealed. A household that had chosen, deliberately, to value people over property. News of Clarissa's visit and Cornelius's response traveled through Elm Hollow within days, as such things always did, and the general consensus among the town's residents settled firmly in Cornelius's favor, several neighbors remarking that they had always found Clarissa's earlier departure considerably more telling about her character than anything she'd said about Winnifred's circumstances now. Winter brought its own trial that year, a hard fever that swept through Elm Hollow and struck little Ida harder than any of her siblings, the same particular danger that had once cost Cornelius his son Peter under circumstances eerily similar to the ones now unfolding in his own household. He recognized the fever's early signs faster than most fathers might have, having lived through the devastating consequences of missing them once already. And he rode for the doctor himself rather than sending a hand, unwilling to trust anyone else's urgency with a child he had come, over the preceding months, to love as fully as any of his own blood. The days that followed tested every ounce of steadiness Cornelius had built since Peter's death, old grief and present fear tangling together as he sat through the worst of Ida's fever, alongside Winnifred, both of them drawing on losses the other understood intimately rather than merely sympathetically. Winnifred, watching him tend the sick child with a devotion that clearly cost him something deep and old, understood finally the full weight of what his steadiness through her own fears had actually meant. A man choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to risk exactly the kind of loss that had once broken him, rather than protect himself by holding back. Ida's fever broke on the 4th morning, and Cornelius wept openly at her bedside, in a manner Winnifred suspected he had not permitted himself since Peter's death 4 years earlier. The relief and the old grief arriving together in a flood, he no longer had the will or the desire to hold back in front of her. Winnifred held him through it, understanding in her own bones exactly what that particular grief cost a person, having buried a husband herself, and having learned that some wounds required witnesses rather than solitude in order to finally begin healing properly. Franklin, watching the whole ordeal from the doorway with the seriousness he brought to every family crisis, told his mother afterward that he had never fully believed Cornelius was truly one of them, until he watched the man's genuine terror over Ida's fever, a terror no hired hand or passing suitor would have carried so completely. Winnifred agreed, understanding that her son had witnessed, in that difficult week, the same proof she herself had finally accepted, that Cornelius's affection for her family carried no hidden transaction beneath it at all. Doc Prentice, confirming Ida's full recovery a week later, remarked to Cornelius privately that he had rarely seen a stepfather so thoroughly wrecked by a child's illness that wasn't biologically his own, a comment Cornelius received with a small, tired smile and the simple reply that blood had very little to do with how thoroughly a person could come to love a child, a lesson his own cold first marriage had never taught him, but Winnifred's noisy, honest household had managed within a single difficult season. Winnifred, once Ida was fully steady on her feet again, found Cornelius alone at Peter's trunk one evening, quietly adding a small carved horse Ida had given him during her recovery to the collection of the boy's old belongings. He told her, when she asked, that he had decided Peter's memory could hold room for Ida's kindness too, that grief did not need to guard itself so jealously against new love finding its way in alongside the old. Winnifred sat with him a long while at the trunk, understanding that the fever had tested them both in ways neither had fully anticipated, and that they had come through it not merely intact, but somehow sturdier than before. Cornelius proposed properly that spring, gathering all 4 children along with Winnifred at the kitchen table, rather than seeking a private moment, telling her plainly that a proposal made to her alone would have felt like courting only half of what he actually wanted, and that he intended for every one of them to hear him say it together. Franklin asked directly for his blessing, granted it with considerable solemnity, on the sole condition that Cornelius continue teaching him proper ranch management, a condition Cornelius accepted readily and with evident relief. They married that June at the small Elm Hollow church, a ceremony considerably warmer than either of their first weddings had been, Winnifred's modest first marriage born of genuine love, cut tragically short, Cornelius's first marriage born of cold arithmetic that had never once served either party well. Doc Prentice attended, along with most of Elm Hollow, and remarked afterward that he had rarely witnessed a wedding where the groom looked quite so thoroughly, unreservedly happy to be marrying into instant fatherhood of 4, rather than merely tolerating it as the price of a bride. Ida, 5 years old and fully recovered from her winter fever, spent the wedding reception firmly attached to Cornelius's leg, exactly as she had every day since the fever broke, declaring to any guest who would listen that she now had a real father who had cried when she was sick, a detail she delivered with the plain, unfiltered honesty only a 5-year-old could manage, and Cornelius laughed harder at that public accounting than he had laughed in years. The ranch prospered considerably in the seasons that followed, not merely in cattle counts and harvest yields, but in the particular, harder-to-measure wealth of a household, finally built on something sturdier than property or arrangement. Franklin grew into a young man who split his time evenly between ranch work and his own budding courtship of a neighboring family's daughter, having learned from Cornelius exactly what a good match actually required, beyond mere land and cattle counts. Hattie and Homer, the twins, grew into considerably less identical people than their childhood suggested they might. Hattie taking to the ranch's bookkeeping with a sharpness Cornelius came to rely on, Homer preferring the physical work of the herds alongside Franklin, and both of them crediting their stepfather, whenever asked, with teaching them that a family's strength lay in each member finding their own particular place within it, rather than being forced into identical molds. Winnifred told Cornelius once, years into their marriage, that she had spent that entire first difficult year waiting for the arithmetic to finally catch up with them, certain that a man who married a penniless widow's brood would eventually calculate the true cost and find it wanting. Cornelius told her, the way he had told her that very first evening on the Elm Hollow platform, that he had never once been performing the calculation she feared, only stating a plain and permanent fact, that a household built on genuine love rather than acreage was, and would always remain, the better deal by every measure that actually mattered. Peter's small trunk found a permanent home in the front room that year, no longer hidden away in the attic, but kept open on a shelf beside the children's own growing collection of treasures, Ida's carved horse resting alongside Peter's old toys, as though the two children, who had never met, had somehow become part of the same continuous family story regardless. Franklin, in later years, would tell his own children that their grandfather, Cornelius, had taught him the truest lesson he ever learned about family, that love multiplied rather than divided, no matter how much grief or how many mouths a household had to make room for along the way.